She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong here." The words landed softly, almost politely. That was the worst part. We were standing just inside the reception hall. White chairs, already set the air smelling faintly of flowers that hadn't fully opened yet. People moved around us carrying clipboards and trays, laughing the way people do when they think everything is settled. I was holding my purse with both hands, knuckles white, my dress pressed and simple. Not bridal, not showy, just appropriate, respectful. I smiled at her, not because I felt kind, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment that she did not. I nodded, once stepped back and said quietly, "All right." Then I walked out. 3 hours later, they would arrive to nothing. No food, no flowers, no wedding. But that came later. I had paid for the entire wedding. Every chair, every plate, every rose, the venue deposit, the caterer, the florist, the strings of lights she'd picked from a catalog, like it was a dream she deserved. I paid for it with money I'd saved over years of military service, years of skipping comforts, years of overtime and deployments, and living smaller than I could have. Because when I commit to something, I commit fully. This wedding wasn't about recognition. It was about family. At least, that's what I believed. I arrived early that morning because that's how I've always lived my life. Early means prepared. Early means you don't make excuses. The venue was a renovated barn just outside town, the kind people like now because it looks authentic. White wood, high ceilings, windows thrown open to let the summer air in. I parked in the gravel lot and sat for a moment before getting out, breathing slowly. I told myself I was proud. I told myself this was a good day. Inside, the coordinator recognized me immediately. She smiled warm and professional. "Everything's set," she said. "You've been wonderful to work with." I thanked her, because manners matter, even when no one is watching. I wandered through the space, quietly, checking nothing, touching nothing. The place looked exactly like it was supposed to, exactly like the vision she'd described when we sat at my kitchen table months ago, her hands wrapped around a mug I'd filled. "I just want it to feel elegant," she'd said, "but simple." I'd smiled then too. When she arrived with her bridesmaids, the room changed. Energy shifted. Laughter got louder. Someone squealed. Someone else clapped. I stayed where I was, out of the way. I've learned not to insert myself into moments that aren't about me, especially after a lifetime in uniform, where the mission always mattered more than the individual. She spotted me almost immediately. Her expression tightened. Not surprise, not joy. Calculation. She walked straight toward me, stopped just close enough to make it intimate, and lowered her voice. "You don't belong here. Not today's complicated. Not we'll talk later. Not this is hard. Just exclusion. Clean and final." I searched her face for a crack, a flicker of uncertainty, something human. There was nothing. People nearby kept moving, unaware. The wedding machine rolled on. I thought about all the checks I'd written, all the receipts in a folder at home, all the years behind that money. I could have reminded her. I could have raised my voice. I could have humiliated her back. Instead, I smiled. That smile wasn't weakness. It was discipline. "I understand," I said. Then I turned and walked out into the sunlight, my heels steady on the gravel, my breathing controlled, the way it's been trained to be under pressure. I sat in my car for a long moment, with the door closed. I didn't cry. That surprised me. What I felt wasn't sadness. It was clarity, because this wasn't new. It was only the first time it had been said out loud. For years, I'd been useful, reliable, The one who paid, planned, smoothed things over. The one who didn't make scenes or demands. The one whose presence was tolerated until it wasn't needed anymore. I started the engine. I didn't drive home. I pulled into a quiet side street, put the car in park, and took out my phone. The first call was to the caterer. She answered on the second ring, cheerful. "Good morning, this is Margaret Collins," I said. "I'm calling about today's event." There was a pause as she pulled up the file. "Yes, Ms. Collins. Everything's on schedule. I need to cancel," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm sorry, cancel," she repeated. "Yes," I said calmly. "Effective immediately. I'll need authorization," she said, cautious. "Now." "I'm the sole payer," I replied. "The contract is in my name." Silence. Then typing. Papers rustling. "Yes," she said slowly. "I see that. I'd like written confirmation," I added. "Thank you." The second call was to the florist. The third, to the venue coordinator. Each conversation was the same. Polite, controlled, factual. No yelling, no explanations. Just ownership. By the time I ended the last call, my hands were steady. My heart was quiet. I sat there for another minute, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. A woman in her early 60s, hair neatly done, eyes tired but clear. I didn't look broken. I looked finished. They would tell their version of the story later. I knew that. They would say I overreacted, that I ruined everything, that I embarrassed them. What they would not be able to say was that I acted without cause. I drove home, changed into comfortable clothes, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the folder where I kept every receipt, every agreement, every canceled check. I lined them up carefully, because silence doesn't mean surrender, and dignity doesn't require permission. When the phone started ringing, I let it go. I already knew what they would say. What mattered was what I had finally said to myself. Part 1, you don't belong here. 1. Euro 67 words continue. Silence has always been misunderstood. People think it means agreement, or fear, or weakness. But anyone who has worn a uniform for most of their adult life knows better. Silence is a tool. Used correctly, it keeps you alive. Used carelessly, it lets others decide your worth for you. I learned that early in the service. I was 22 when I enlisted, young enough to think discipline was about obedience instead of restraint. I grew up in a house where voices were raised easily, and apologies came late, if at all. The military taught me something different. That control wasn't about dominance, but about knowing when not to react. You learn quickly that shouting solves nothing. You learn to listen past tone, past ego, past the noise. You learn to keep your face neutral, even when someone questions your competence, your choices, your place in the room, especially your place. Over the years, silence became second nature. When promotions passed me by, I told myself it wasn't personal. When others took credit for work I had quietly carried, I reminded myself that the mission mattered more than recognition. When I sent money home or covered expenses no one else wanted to claim, I said nothing because I could afford to, and because I didn't want gratitude to become leverage. That wedding fund was built the same way. Slowly, carefully, without announcements. I set the money aside over years. Hazard pay bonuses, unspent allowances from deployments, where I lived out of a duffel bag and learned to sleep anywhere. I could have remodeled my kitchen. I could have traveled. I could have retired earlier. Instead, I saved. Not because anyone asked me to, because I believed family meant stepping up quietly when it mattered. When she got engaged, she cried in my living room. said she was overwhelmed, said weddings were expensive, and she didn't know how they'd manage. "I can help," I said. I remember the relief on her face. Not gratitude relief, as if something she'd assumed would be covered suddenly was. I didn't correct that assumption. We planned together, or at least I listened while she planned. I nodded. I paid deposits. I asked only practical questions, dates, times, numbers. I stayed out of decisions that didn't concern me. I told myself that was respect. Looking back, I see now that it was erasure disguised as generosity. The disrespect didn't begin at the venue. It had been building for years, in small ways I chose not to name. Invitations discussed, but not sent. Decisions made without my input. Jokes that landed just a little too sharply, followed by, "Oh, you know what I mean." And every time I let it go, because silence felt safer than confrontation. Because I didn't want to be the difficult one. Because women my age are taught explicitly, or not, that gratitude is conditional and presence is negotiable. The military doesn't train you to demand affection. It trains you to endure. So when she said, "You don't belong here," it wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a conclusion she'd reached long ago. I was useful. I was generous. I was invisible. Until I wasn't. That's the moment silence stopped being protection and became permission for them. Driving away from the venue, I thought about all the times I'd swallowed words to keep peace. All the times I'd told myself, this isn't worth a fight. What I realized, sitting alone at my kitchen table later that afternoon, was that no one had ever told me to stay quiet. I'd chosen it, and choice, once recognized, can be changed. The calls I made weren't impulsive. They were the result of years of documentation, of contracts read carefully, of knowing exactly where my name appeared and where it didn't. People underestimate quiet people. They assume silence means disengagement. They assume generosity comes without boundaries. They're wrong. That evening, I ate dinner alone. Something simple. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't distract myself. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. The phone rang again, and again. I watched it light up and go dark. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was reclaiming authorship. The military taught me many things, but one lesson stood above the rest. If you don't define your own limits, someone else will. That wedding wasn't canceled out of spite. It was canceled because respect had been revoked. And respect, like service, is not owed to those who humiliate you and expect gratitude in return. I didn't think I'd ever make those calls. Not because I didn't know how, but because for most of my life, I believed there were calls you only made when everything else had failed. Emergency calls, last resort calls, the kind that burned bridges you might need later. That belief had kept me careful. It had also kept me small. I learned how to make difficult calls in the service. You don't raise your voice. You don't apologize for existing. You state facts, confirm authority, and document outcomes. Emotion stays out of it, not because you don't feel it, but because feeling doesn't change terms. The first call had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, almost. The caterer had verified the contract, confirmed my name, and agreed to send written confirmation. I thanked her and ended the call. The second call, florist, took longer. She hesitated, asked questions that weren't really questions. I answered once. When she asked again, I repeated myself. "I'm the payer," I said. "Please proceed." By the third call, I felt something settle in me. A calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, control. I wasn't undoing a wedding. I was correcting an assumption. After the venue coordinator confirmed the cancellation and promised an email Within the hour, I sat back and looked at my phone. 4 calls, all documented, all clean. I didn't call the bride. I didn't call her father. I didn't call anyone who might try to argue feelings against facts. I made only the calls that mattered. Then I put the phone face down on the table. For the rest of the afternoon, I went about my day. I watered the plants. I folded laundry. I organized a drawer that hadn't been touched in months. The ordinary things people do when their lives are supposed to be falling apart. The house stayed quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but it was a familiar quiet. The kind I'd known during deployments when letters came slowly, and the world shrank to whatever you could control inside 4 walls. I checked my email at 5 o'clock. 4 confirmations sat in my inbox. Each one polite, each one final. I printed them. Old habit, paper matters when stories start changing. I placed the documents in a folder and set it by the door. That's when the phone rang again. I answered this time. "What did you do?" her voice demanded. Not confusion, not concern, accusation. "I canceled the contracts," I said. "You can't do that," she snapped. "It's my wedding. It was my payment," I replied, a sharp inhale. "You're trying to control me." I closed my eyes for a moment. "No," I said. "I'm responding to what you told me." Silence on the other end. "You embarrassed me," she said finally. "I was humiliated," I answered. "That's not the same," she insisted. "It is," I said. "You just weren't the one on the receiving end." Her voice rose. She accused. She reframed. She told me I'd ruined everything. I let her speak. When she paused, I said one sentence. "You accepted my money and rejected my presence." She hung up. I didn't call back. An hour later, her father called. His tone was measured, careful, the way men sound when they believe reason will restore order. "Let's talk this through," he said. "There's nothing to talk through," I replied. "You're acting out of anger," he said. "No," I said again. "I'm acting out of clarity." He sighed. "You've always been sensitive." That was when I knew the conversation was over. Sensitivity is the word people use when they benefit from your restraint. After that, the messages came quickly. Texts from relatives, half-informed accusations, suggestions that I was being dramatic, that I'd misunderstood, that I should be the bigger person. I didn't respond. I had already been the bigger person. For years. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke early, as I always do. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching light creep across the yard. Somewhere across town, people were waking up expecting a wedding. I felt no triumph. What I felt was something closer to alignment, like a joint that had been out of place, finally sliding back where it belonged. By mid-morning, the phone was quiet. I knew what that meant. The truth had reached the venue. I imagined the scene without pleasure. Guests arriving to lock doors, confused vendors, a coordinator explaining cancellations in a low voice, flowers never delivered, food never prepared, no spectacle, just absence. Absence speaks loudly when expectations are high. I didn't go near the place. I didn't need to. Distance has always been my ally. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the venue coordinator. "I'm so sorry this happened," she wrote. "I hope you're all right." I replied with a single sentence. "Thank you for your professionalism." That was the end of my involvement. People like to call this revenge. They imagine satisfaction, smirking, a sense of victory. But what they don't understand is that revenge, when done quietly, feels nothing like celebration. It feels like closing a door you've been holding open too long. Your arm, aching your patience, worn thin, your kindness, mistaken for obligation. I hadn't planned to teach anyone a lesson. I had simply refused to be used. And sometimes, that's the most instructive thing you can do. They arrived to nothing. Not a locked gate with a sign. Not a dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet, unmistakable absence, where certainty had been promised. I learned most of what happened later, pieced together from messages, secondhand accounts, in the careful wording people use when they don't want to admit they were wrong. But I can picture it clearly enough without being there. Cars pulling into the gravel lot, tires crunching where pedals were supposed to be scattered, guests stepping out in pressed suits, in summer dresses, checking their phones, glancing around for direction. The barn doors open, but the space inside bare no tables, dressed, no centerpieces, no music warming the air. No coordinator greeting them with a clipboard and a smile, just an echo. Someone would have laughed first, nervously. Someone always does. A joke about being early, about vendors running behind. The kind of humor people use to keep panic at bay. Then the questions would start. Did we get the time wrong? Is this the right place? Where's the food? Phones would come out. Calls made, messages sent. No answers. The florist never loaded the van. The caterer never fired up the kitchen. The rental company never delivered chairs or linens. Everything had stopped exactly where it was supposed to, before money changed hands, before labor was spent, before effort was wasted on a celebration that no longer existed. The absence would have felt personal, even though it wasn't aimed at the guests at all. It was aimed at a belief. The belief that someone could be erased and still expected to provide. By the time my phone rang again that morning, I had already gone for a walk. The air was warm, the sky painfully blue. The kind of day people describe as perfect for a wedding. I let the phone ring. When I checked it later, there were 14 missed calls and more messages than I cared to count. I listened to none of the voicemails. I'd learned long ago that when people are panicking, they don't speak truth, they speak fear. Around noon, my sister-in-law called. She had always been quieter than the others, observant, careful. They're saying, "You did this to punish her," she said. "I did this to stop something." I replied, "To stop what she asked." I took a breath. To stop pretending. She was silent for a moment. "They didn't think you'd go through with it." "I know," I said. That sentence carried more weight than it should have. It said everything about how they'd viewed me. As reliable. As accommodating. As someone whose limits were theoretical. They were wrong. Later, a cousin texted me a photo. The barn, empty. Chairs stacked in the corner, unused. Sunlight streaming through open windows onto a floor that had never been danced on. I didn't respond. I wasn't avoiding accountability. I was refusing to participate in a narrative that required my shame to function. In the afternoon, her father came to my door. I saw his car pull up and felt nothing. No dread, no anger, just readiness. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked tired, rumpled, older than he had the last time I'd seen him. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. Briefly. He walked in and stood, not sitting down. His eyes moved around my living room, taking in the ordinary details. Bookshelves, framed photos, a life not built around spectacle. "This didn't have to happen," he said. "It already did," I replied. "You embarrassed her," he said. "In front of everyone." I nodded once. "She humiliated me in private." "That came first." He frowned. "She was under a lot of stress." "So was I said. "For years." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. "You could have handled this differently." "Yes," I said. "I could have swallowed it." Again. His shoulders slumped slightly. She didn't think you'd take it this far. That's the problem, I said calmly. She didn't think about me at all. We stood there for a moment, the truth settling between us. Your family, he said finally. I met his eyes. Then, I should have been treated like it. He left without another word. That evening, the story began to change, as stories do when facts refuse to cooperate. People said the wedding had been postponed, that there had been a misunderstanding, that vendors had made mistakes. No one said my name. That too was familiar. But something else happened as well, quietly, privately. One message came from a friend of the bride, a woman I'd always liked, though we'd never been close. I saw what happened, she wrote. You didn't deserve that. I read it twice. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to smooth things over. It was acknowledgement. I replied with a simple thank you. As night fell, I sat on my porch with a glass of water and listened to the neighborhood settle. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling. Somewhere else, laughter drifted across a fence. Life went on. I thought about how many times I'd attended events where I felt out of place, but stayed anyway, believing endurance was love, believing silence was loyalty. What I understood now was that endurance without respect is just slow erasure. They had arrived expecting a celebration built on my quiet compliance. Instead, they were met with the cost of their certainty. No shouting, no scene. Just the sudden, unmistakable presence of consequences. The truth has a way of surfacing, whether people are ready for it or not. In the days that followed, it moved through the family like a slow tide, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. At first, there were attempts to control the narrative. Careful phone calls, selective explanations. The kind of damage control people practice when they believe the story matters more than the facts. But facts have weight, and I had kept them. 3 days after the wedding that never happened, I received a message asking if we could talk things through. Neutral language. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just an assumption that conversation would soften what had already been done. I agreed to meet at my house, not because I owed anyone my time, but because clarity is easier face to face. They arrived together, she and her father. Not dressed for a fight, not dressed for humility either. Somewhere in between, like people who expect resolution without accountability. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where we'd once discussed guest lists and centerpieces, the same one where she'd cried about budgets and dreams. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. She spoke first. I didn't mean it the way you took it, she said. That sentence has lived many lives. It's flexible, convenient, designed to undo harm without naming it. I took it the way it was said, I replied. She shifted in her chair. It was stressful. Everyone was watching. You didn't want me there? I said, gently. That part was clear. Her father leaned forward. This is getting blown out of proportion. I reached into the folder I'd brought and slid it across the table. Receipts, contracts, cancellations. Every page labeled, every date highlighted. I didn't cancel out of emotion, I said. I canceled because my name was on every legal agreement, because my money was funding an event I was told I didn't belong at. Silence settled in. She stared at the papers, her mouth opening slightly. You never said there were conditions. There were none, I said, until respect was withdrawn. Her father cleared his throat. Family doesn't act like this. I met his eyes. Family doesn't humiliate someone who made their celebration possible. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the truth had displaced something fragile and false. She crossed her arms. So what you wanted everyone to know you paid. No, I said. I wanted you to know I mattered. That landed. Her expression changed, not defensiveness this time, but confusion, as if the idea had never occurred to her. I didn't think she began. That's the sentence I said quietly. You didn't think about me as a person, just as a resource. Her father exhaled sharply. You're being harsh. I'm being precise, I replied. We sat in silence for a moment longer. Then I said the thing that had been waiting. You don't get to take my years of service, my savings, my quiet support, and then decide I'm inconvenient to your image. Her eyes filled, not with tears exactly, with realization. I didn't know it would hurt you that much, she said. That's because you never asked, I replied. I wasn't angry anymore. That part had passed. What remained was something steadier. Boundaries. I closed the folder and placed my hand on top of it. This isn't about punishment, I said. It's about honesty. You can tell whatever story you need to tell publicly, but privately, this is the truth. Her father stood. So what happens now? I thought about that. Now, I said, we stop pretending nothing happened. She looked at me. Then, not as a sponsor, not as a problem, but as someone who had drawn a line and stood behind it. I'm sorry, she said finally, for what I said, for how I treated you. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real enough. I nodded. Thank you. We didn't hug. We didn't resolve everything, but something had shifted. When they left, I sat at the table alone for a while, listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I realized something important in that moment. Humiliation thrives in secrecy. Truth dismantles it. They had wanted a version of events where I was emotional, unreasonable, vindictive, a story that absolved them without reflection. What they got instead was documentation. And documentation doesn't argue. In the days that followed, the tone changed. Messages softened. Accusations stopped. Some relatives went quiet, entirely, unwilling to choose sides, once the facts were undeniable. That was fine. I wasn't interested in loyalty built on denial. What mattered was that the story could no longer be twisted to exclude my dignity. I had said nothing publicly. I hadn't defended myself on social media. I hadn't demanded understanding. I had simply refused to lie. And in doing so, I'd given everyone else a choice: believe the truth or live with its absence. The days that followed were quieter. Not peaceful, not yet, but quieter in the way things get after a storm has passed and the air hasn't quite settled. People moved more carefully. Words were chosen with more thought. The urgency to explain, to accuse, to rewrite, slowly lost its energy. That's what happens when there's nothing left to argue against. I didn't reach out. I didn't check in. I let space do what it does best, separate what is genuine from what is convenient. A week later, I received a message from her. Not a long one, not emotional. Can we talk again? Just us. I agreed. We met at a small cafe, halfway between our homes. Neutral ground. No history in the walls. She arrived early and stood when she saw me, uncertain whether to hug me or not. We didn't. We sat across from each other with coffee between us, steam rising like a boundary. Neither of us was ready to cross. I've been angry, she said finally, but not at you, at myself. I listened. I didn't realize how often I treated your help like something automatic, she continued. Like it was just there. I nodded once. That's how it usually starts. She swallowed. I didn't mean to erase you. I know I said. Most people don't. They just get used to what they're given. She looked down at her hands. I thought saying you didn't belong would simplify things. I felt the sting of that word again, but it no longer cut as deeply. Simplifying people is dangerous, I said. It turns them into objects. She looked up. I'm sorry. This time, the apology landed differently. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't asking for absolution. It was ownership. I don't expect everything to go back, she added quickly. I know I broke something. Yes, I said. You did. We sat with that truth. Then she asked, is there any way forward? I thought carefully before answering. There is, I said, but it won't look the way it did before, and it won't involve money favors or silence. She nodded slowly. I understand. That was reconciliation, not reunion, not restoration of the old pattern, but the start of a new one, built on clarity instead of obligation. When we stood to leave, she reached for my hand. I let her hold it for a moment, then gently pulled away. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for listening, I replied. After that, the family adjusted. Some members kept their distance. Others tested boundaries. A few never spoke to me again. That, too, was information. I redirected the money I'd saved. Some of it went to a veterans scholarship fund. Some went to repairs on my home I'd postponed for years. And a small portion I used for myself. A trip I'd delayed. Comfort I'd denied. Not out of spite, out of balance. I thought often about the word revenge and how people misuse it. What I did wasn't revenge. I didn't destroy her life. I didn't humiliate her publicly. I didn't take pleasure in her distress. I removed my support, and in doing so, I forced the truth into the open. Justice doesn't always arrive wearing authority. Sometimes it shows up as a receipt, a boundary, and the courage to say no more. One afternoon, a neighbor asked me what had happened to the wedding. I smiled politely. Plans changed. That was all, because dignity doesn't require explanation. What I learned from all of this, what years of service and one painful moment finally taught me, is that love without respect becomes sacrifice without meaning, and silence, when it protects others at your expense, is no longer honorable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an ending. I simply chose myself. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges if you let it. Months passed. The wedding became something people spoke about less and less, replaced by new stories, new distractions. Life moved forward, as it always does. What remained wasn't the absence of flowers or food, but the presence of something steadier. Respect. My relationship with her settled into something quieter. We spoke occasionally, carefully. No assumptions, no unspoken debts. When we met, we spoke like two adults learning each other again, without the old roles pressing in. She never asked for the money back. I never offered. That chapter was closed. I spent my mornings differently now. Longer walks, fewer obligations. I volunteered twice a month with a local veterans outreach group, helping women my age navigate benefits paperwork and housing applications. Women who, like me, had learned early to endure quietly. I saw myself in them. One afternoon, a woman about my age looked up from a stack of forms and said, I didn't know I was allowed to say no. I smiled gently. Most of us weren't taught that. That's when I understood the lesson I'd been circling all along. What happened at that wedding wasn't just about humiliation or money or family drama. It was about boundaries, financial, emotional, moral, about knowing where generosity ends and self-erasure begins. I had confused sacrifice with love. They are not the same. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. Family that demands silence in exchange for belonging is not family. Those truths aren't loud. They don't trend, but they endure. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once planned a wedding I would never attend, and wrote a short list on a notepad. Things I will no longer do quietly. I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, not as a reminder of anger, but as a record of growth. When I think back to the moment she said, "You don't belong here," I don't feel the sting anymore. I feel gratitude, because clarity, even when it hurts, is a gift. It shows you exactly where you stand and where you don't. If you're listening to this story and you've ever given more than was returned, if you've ever stayed silent to keep peace at your own expense, if you've ever been made to feel invisible in a place you helped build, I hope you remember this. Dignity is not something you earn by enduring disrespect. It's something you protect by setting boundaries. And it's never too late, no matter your age, no matter your role, to choose yourself without bitterness. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on it. If it mirrors part of your own life, you're welcome to share your experience in the comments. And if you believe quiet stories of strength and self-respect deserve to be heard, I invite you to stay, listen, and subscribe. Some endings don't close doors. They open clearer paths.